Okay, so the last time that we talked, we went through the the nerves part of the nervous system, talked about the shape of what an individual nerve cell would look like, and where those nerves are going to originate from. So we know that some of those nerves are going to extend off the base of the brain and take care of the upper region of the body. And then you're going to have a series of nerves that will extend off of the spinal cord, and then they reach out to all the parts of the body. And so for this particular talk, we're going to get a little bit more into the specifics about the spinal cord, and ultimately we are going to end up talking about the parts of the brain and how they function. So just kind of pulling those three major parts of the nervous system, the nerves, the spinal cord, and the brain, and giving them a little bit of focus. So when you look at your packet, talking about the spinal cord, a lot of times when people think about the spinal cord, they have kind of a misconception. They think of the bone structure and everything surrounding the spinal cord. The spinal cord is just that soft tissue that you have running through the vertebral column. On average, your spinal cord is going to be about the size of your pinky finger. So if you think about your individual pinky finger, that will give you a little bit of a frame of reference for just how thick your spinal cord is. Now, there are a couple of places where it has a little bit of a bulge, and so it's a little bit bigger than that, but for the most part, that's a good average to kind of think about. The spinal cord itself is also a bundle of nervous tissue, and so it's not hard and rigid, it's actually very soft. Best example that I can give you on that is to kind of think of cooked spaghetti. So once you get that consistency of fully cooked spaghetti, and how easy you'd be able to cut that with a fork, that is essentially the consistency of your spinal cord. And so you have to worry about injury to the vertebrae, those bones protecting your spinal cord, because of just how soft it actually is. So the spinal cord is going to come from a transition off the bottom of the brain. So you guys can see the picture there. You have the brain structure, and then it's going to begin to taper. You have the brain stem through the core, which is that transition point from the brain itself down into the actual spinal cord. When you run the spinal cord down, a couple of things that you'll notice. As I mentioned, you do have two places where you have an enlargement. So you have a cervical enlargement and you have a lumbar enlargement. And the reason that you're going to see a bulge in those two places where it's going to be a little bit thicker is because those are the two places where a majority of your nerves are going to branch off. So at the cervical enlargement, that's where you get a bunch of nerves that are going to branch off, and they're going to extend not just to the chest of your body, but they have to run all the way down the arms as well and take care of that region. And so you need to have more nerves in that place because they're extending out further. The second location where you see an enlargement is the lumbar enlargement. And likewise, this is where most of the nerves are going to come from that are going to run all the way down the length of your legs down to your toes and take care of making sure that you have information getting to all of those parts of your body. So that's the reason why you see a little bit larger size in the spinal cord in those two places. When you get down to the bottom of the spinal cord, there's a couple of things that I want you to kind of notice. So when we get to the lumbar region, which is the last 5 vertebrae of the spinal cord that are individual, when we get into the sacrum and the coccyx, those are fused bones. And by the time that the spinal cord is getting down into those two areas, it has started to fray. And so you'll notice that the last term that you have there on the spinal cord picture, on the left-hand side, it's the cauda equina. That is translated to horse's tail. And if you think about what a horse's tail looks like, you have all the individual strands of hair, and likewise, when we talk about this part of the spinal cord, it has started to fray, and it's not a core piece anymore, but you have these individual strands that are coming off of it. So when we go from the lumbar vertebrae and we start to transition down into that sacrum part and then ultimately the coccyx, you're now into these strands of spinal cord. On the right-hand side, you have a little bit different view of the spinal cord. So they've removed all of the bone structure. At the very top, you can see the brainstem, that transition part from the brain. get a little bit better view of the two enlargements, the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. And then the last one that you have on there is called the filum terminale. And anytime it comes from the word terminal, which means the end. And so you're getting to that end part of the spinal cord where it's eventually going to taper and completely end. And so that's why you have that particular name there. The picture on the left gives you a little bit better idea of how your spinal cord runs down. It's not straight up and down. It does have some bends and some curvatures to it, which we need to have. The picture on the right does make it look a little bit more straight and narrow, but that's just to give you an idea of what the spinal cord would look like when it's by itself. If you go to the second slide, it talks about the meningeal layers. And the meningeal layers are going to cover both the brain and the spinal cord. So you'll notice that the pictures you have here actually show it surrounding the brain. But please understand that it covers the brain, and then as it transitions into the spinal cord, it does go ahead and cover the spinal cord as well. The meningeal layers are going to be 3 layers of connective tissue that you have within the nervous system that are going to help protect the brain and the spinal cord. And so they do a couple of things. One of the biggest things that they will do is they will help hold the cerebrospinal fluid to the brain and the spinal cord. And we haven't talked about cerebrospinal fluid a whole lot yet, but it's essentially a fluid that is going to wash over and basically bathe your brain and your spinal cord, making sure that it is getting nourishment, it is cleaning it of any debris or other buildup that you might have around the neurons, and just making sure that everything is kept new and fresh. So the meningeal layers are going to wrap themselves around the brain and the spinal cord, and they help anchor and hold it in place. Not that you have a lot of excess space when you're talking about the brain and the spinal cord, but still want to have that protective layer around the areas. It will also help hold your blood vessels in place. Again, covering the surface, you want to make sure that they are where they need to be. And so these meningeal layers will help with that as well. You have 3 different types of meningeal layers. The first one is the dura mater, and then you have the arachnoid mater, and then the last one that you have is the pia mater. So if we're looking at these 3 layers, the dura mater is the outermost layer. It's a very tough type of connective tissue that you have, and this is going to be the layer that would actually touch the bone. So if you're trying to put this in a frame of reference, this is going to be a layer of connective tissue that would run right inside the skull or run right inside the vertebrae. If you're a visual type learner, think of crack open egg, that skin that you have that lines the inside of the eggshell. That is essentially what the dura mater is. Okay? It's going to line that outermost cavity. The second layer that we have is the arachnoid mater, and most people, when they hear the term arachnoid, they think of spider, and that is where the name actually comes from. This particular layer, because it's sandwiched in between the other 2, you have to have the ability for material to go between the 3 layers. And so this can't be a solid sheet of connective tissue, because it would then create a barrier from things being able to get from the dura mater to the pia mater. So this layer in between has a spider web-like appearance. So there are threads, it weaves, so that it has some structure to it, but it also has those holes or those gaps every so often. So like I said, material can move between all 3 layers or among all 3 layers. Arachnoid, like I said, going back to that spider web-like appearance that it does actually have. And then the last one is going to be the pia mater. The pia mater is the innermost layer. This is actually going to touch the structures themselves. So the pia mater is going to come in direct contact with the brain and come in direct contact with the spinal cord. Now, with the pia mater, it doesn't just kind of wrap itself around. It is actually going to adhere to all of the grooves. So the surface of your brain is not smooth. There are peaks and valleys. The pia mater will actually rise and fall with those peaks and valleys and adhere very closely to it. Likewise, within the spinal cord, you do have some grooves within the spinal cord, and the pia mater will follow those grooves. The next slide that you have talks about the cerebrospinal fluid itself. Often gets abbreviated as CSF, so if you are comfortable with that abbreviation, that is perfectly fine. The cerebral spinal fluid, when we talk about it, it's not an incredible amount of fluid. In your packet, if you look at the slide, it says it's about 120 milliliters, and that's hard for people to kind of imagine. But if you think of a can of soda, a 12-ounce can of soda, that's in the neighborhood of 255 milliliters. So it's more than double of the amount of cerebral spinal fluid that you have. And when you put that into perspective, 120 milliliters of the cerebral spinal fluid is going to constantly be washing through your central nervous system, taking care of your brain, taking care of your spinal cord, making sure that you don't get any bacteria buildup or anything like that. That nourishment, that the ions that this part of your body needs are constantly being brought to the brain and the spinal cord itself. It's a pretty big job, and we don't really have a whole lot of fluid that is getting that done. Now, the unique thing about the cerebral spinal fluid is it is a continuous flushing process. So it's constantly moving over the brain and the spinal cord and working through the system, but it's not the exact same fluid that is constantly working through the system. It's very much like if you think of your bathtub, and if you were to leave the drain open and turn on the water, you would get constant fluid coming in, but at the same time, you're draining fluid off. And that's the same exchange that you have going on within your central nervous system. There is constantly new cerebral spinal fluid being brought in, and at the same time, you constantly have some being drained off. And that's to make sure that if you do have any debris or anything that's going on within the nervous system, the hope is that you can drain that off and get rid of it, and that you're not constantly cycling that same dirty material through the brain and through the spinal cord. So we do have a system in place where new is being brought in and the old is being flushed off. So you'll notice that it talks about the choroid plexus. Choroid plexus is going to be kind of that faucet bringing in the new cerebral spinal fluid. So that's where the new material is going to come into the system. And then if you look at the about halfway through, it talks about the arachnoid villi. Villi are basically tiny little straws, and we will talk about these again when we get into our urinary system, our excretory system. So villi, wherever we have them in the body, they are going to usually drain or pull material out. And so when we look at the arachnoid villi, which are specific to the nervous system, you have a different type of villi in the excretory system. But these are going to pull that old cerebral spinal fluid out and allow it to be drained from the body. Again, the most important thing that the cerebral spinal fluid is going to do, it brings nourishment to your neurons. It's also going to bring ions. Remember, your nerves are going to fire an impulse, and in order to be able to do that, they need to have those positive and negative charges to get that electrical impulse moving, that current kind of set up. So it's the job of the cerebral spinal fluid to make sure that the proper ions are always available so that that electrical impulse can be fired. The next slide that you have talks about the parts of the spinal cord, and you'll notice here you have two types of matter. You have white matter and you have gray matter. And this goes back to a conversation that we had in our previous lecture when we were talking about neurons. And we talked about the fact that some of your nerve cells have a protective layer called myelin sheath that's going to cover them. And because that myelin sheath is made out of fat, it's going to give those areas or those neurons a lighter colored appearance. And so we refer to those as white matter. You have another set of neurons that are not going to have a protective covering. And the true color of a neuron all by itself without that protective covering is gray. So gray matter indicates those neurons that do not have myelin protecting them. And then your lighter colored or white matter is going to be that group of neurons that has that protective covering over the top of it. So when you look at the spinal cord, you'll notice that you have that darker region at the core. That is the gray matter. So what looks like a butterfly at the very, very core, that is your gray matter within your spinal cord. And the outer region, the lighter colored area, that is actually white matter. So you can see the location of white and gray matter within your spinal cord. Now, a couple of the terms that we have here, I want you to identify where the anterior median fissure is. It's on the bottom side, right in the middle. And then I also want you to find the posterior median sulcus. That's on the top, right in the middle. Once you have found those two terms, and I mean the lines themselves are in the middle, not the terms are in the middle, but it looks like the spinal cord is a whole piece. And the one thing that I want you guys to understand is that your spinal cord is almost severed in half. So when you look at the posterior median sulcus, a sulcus is a groove that you have within a particular structure, and then the fissure, the anterior median fissure on the other side, that is also a groove. So when you see those two lines diving into the spinal cord, they are almost cutting it in half. The only place where the spinal cord is truly connected all the way through is right at the location that's identified as the gray commissure and has a little bracket next to it. That little bridge right there, that is the only place where the right and the left side of your spinal cord are actually fully attached to each other. Those two, the sulcus and the fissure that you have there, those are actually cuts, okay, dividing it into a right and a left side. So with the central canal that you also see on the spinal cord, that central canal, that is where the cerebral spinal fluid is going to run through on the inside. You have cerebral spinal fluid that will coat the outside and be adhered within those Meninge layers. But right at the core, you also have a stream of cerebral spinal fluid that will run through, and that is going to take place within that central canal. So when you really look at this, you can see just how thin that bridge is between the two sides of the spinal cord and how much or how little connection there actually is. The other thing that I want you guys to take a look at very closely is if you find the funiculus. So you have a lateral funiculus, you also have an anterior funiculus, and you have a posterior funiculus. So three. Lateral telling you it's on the side, posterior telling you it's on the back side, anterior telling you that it's on the front side. What I want you to understand is anytime you are talking about funiculus, you are talking about the bundles of nerves that you have within the white matter. So funiculus is attached to white matter. On the other side of that, you'll notice that you have horns. So you have a posterior horn, you have an anterior horn within the gray part of the spinal cord, and wherever you are referring to a horn, that indicates that you are in the gray matter. So funiculus pertains to white matter, the horns refer to your gray matter. The next one that you have kind of ties back to what we were talking about with our nerves. So understanding that there is a kind of assembly line that happens with information coming into the body. You have receptors that are going to pick up that information. That information is then relayed to the central nervous system, and that can either be the spinal cord or the brain. Your information does not always have to go all the way to the brain to be processed. Within the central nervous system, it will be processed, and then you will figure out how you're going to respond. And depending on the response that your body decides you need to carry out, it will either go to a motor or efferent neuron. So it's either going to be carried out by a muscle or it's going to be carried out by a gland. And again, that depends on the situation. Stepping on something sharp with a bare foot, that's going to be a motor response. Your muscles would be involved in causing you to pull your foot back off of it. If you are in a scary situation, that is going to be then your glands that are going to cause all of the fight or flight response that you guys need to be carried out. So depending on what you are confronted with will determine how your brain or your spinal cord processes it, and then ultimately what is carried out and how you respond. The next slide that you have talks about the parts of the spinal reflex, and this ties into what I was talking about, that not everything always has to go all the way to your brain to be processed. So you can see, number one, that some sort of stimuli has come into a receptor located in your skin, and if you follow those arrows, it's going to use the sensory neuron, and it's going to track through your nerves to your spinal cord, and you can see the cross section of your spinal cord there. Once that information comes in, it is processed within the neurons of the spinal cord, and it immediately gets looped right back out to the motor neuron and ultimately to a muscle for you to carry out the response. So this would be an example of a reflex, like I said, an innate response that is built in and you immediately know how to react to that particular situation. So this is just showing you kind of that circuit that your body would use for a quick reflex. You can send it right to the spinal cord just sends it right back out. You get the response that you need, and you reduce the amount of time that it takes because it doesn't have to go all the way to the brain to be processed. For the next two slides that we have on here, ascending and descending tracks, in no way, shape, or form do I expect you to memorize the ascending or the descending tracks, but I do want you to understand that we have tracks within our spinal cord, and they're very much like elevators with one small difference. Because of how information travels through our nervous system, it is either going to be going up or it's going to be going down, but you can't have information going both directions within a bundle of nerves. So you can't have information that's being sent up to the brain and the spinal cord to be processed, and at the same time having your brain and your spinal cord trying to send information back down. They would run into each other, and that information would never make its destination. So the nervous system had to design a way where you have bundles of nerves that are only going to take information to the brain or to the spinal cord, and then you are going to have a different set of bundles of nerves that will take that information back out. So they do work like elevators, going up or going down, but the difference is they only work in one direction. They can only take information up, or they can only take information down so that they don't crash into each other. So if they are a bundle of nerves that are taking information up to the brain or the spinal cord, that is going to be an ascending track. If they are carrying the response back out to the body, that is going to take place within a descending track. There are lots of different tracks. Again, if you were going to be specific in this area, you would need to know those individual names. We do not need to know the individual names for our purposes. The next slide talks about the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. We've touched on these a couple of times already, just knowing that all of your nerves that take care of all the parts of your body are going to come from one of two places. It's going to come off your brain, the cranials, or it's going to come off of your spinal cord, and aka your spinal nerves. The next slide that you guys have talks about the spinal nerves, and the picture, the only thing I don't like about this picture is it makes it look like the nerves stop at your shoulder or they stop at your hip. Please understand that those nerves would go all the way down your arm, or they would go all the way down your leg, but it shows you the spinal cord, and then it shows you the vertebrae, C1, C2, down into your thoracic vertebrae, T1, T2, your lumbars, L1, L2. So those spinal nerves are indicating where they would extend out of. So those spinal nerves, if they have a C letter designation, those are coming out of your cervical vertebrae. If it's a T letter, those are coming out of your thoracic vertebrae. And if it has an L, those are extending out of your lumbars. Now, when you look at this, the indication here would kind of give you an idea. If you have a injury to the spinal cord where it was severed, let's say you sever the spinal cord between C1 and C2, you can see how high up that is. Once you sever the spinal cord, completely cut through it, no information can get past that point. So you can see all the parts of the body, all those nerves that would no longer be getting information from the brain, and how that would greatly impact or change what the body would be able to do. If you change that, and now let's say the spinal cord is severed between L4 and L5, all the way on the other end of the spinal cord, well, now all of those other nerves between that point from the brain down to L4, all of those are still going to be able to get information from the brain. And so now you are going to see a vast difference in what the body would still be able to do. So depending on where the spinal cord is severed would show you where that communication would stop from the brain to those nerves. So once it's cut, nothing below that point is going to get any information or communication from the brain at that point. So that concludes our spinal cord. I'm actually going to stop the video at this point and do a second video for the brain. You are free to watch them continuously. If you want to immediately go to the brain video and watch that back to back, that's fine. If you want to take a break and come back to the second video later, completely up to you.